Hi, this is Ben with Novelux Stereophonic. Today I'm going to be shooting part 2 of the KLH Model 5 restoration. So in this video I'm going to be going over some cabinet repair and refinishing. So these cabinets are in pretty good shape, and if I was just trying to do a quick repair and resale of these, I'd just touch these up with Restore Finish. And it would take away a lot of these blemishes and make everything look kind of uniform. But I really wanted to go all the way on these and do a really nice refinish on them, because KLH used some great veneer on this stuff. And when these are properly done up, they just look fantastic. So that's what I'm going to be going over in this video. We've got a change of scenery today. I'm here at Sky-Fi Audio in Glen Rock, New Jersey. I work part-time here as a service technician. This is my bench over here. It's very similar to what I run at my home bench that you see on my Novelux Stereophonic channel, just a little bit less test equipment, but this is where I work a few days a week. Let's take a quick tour around the shop while I'm in here. So we buy and sell vintage audio electronics and are Klipsch and Macintosh dealers. Tons of cool stuff here. This is the speaker bay. And one of the reasons that I don't post more content on my channel is I'm so busy keeping up with the service log here at Sky-Fi. So this is just a sampling of some of the awesome Mac equipment I get to work on. Audio research, Marantz. We just have so much cool equipment here. And the list of broken stuff is endless, so it keeps me plenty busy. Anyways, let's get on to getting these KLH Model 5s refinished. Here's a closer look at some of the stuff that I'd like to tackle here. Some of the finish has already been damaged here on the side, so I'm going to take this down to bare walnut. That's this entire top section of the speaker. We also have some water stains, some chips. Down here we have some gouges. This stuff I can't really do much about, but once that's sanded down and down to bare wood, once the finish goes in there, it'll become much less visible. I've also got some damaged corners like stuff here. This I'm going to do some epoxy fill and bring this to square. It always makes speaker cabinets look much nicer when everything's squared up on the corners, even if it's not all original wood. But before we get going on that, I need to get the drivers unloaded from these. So these speakers are pretty darn heavy when they're fully loaded. And also I'm going to be doing a lot of sanding here, so I don't want to have a bunch of the sawdust and everything getting into the driver. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all the drivers. I'm going to build a cardboard mask for this, and then I also need to mask off this black trim here because I am going to be sanding along this edge. One of the nice things about this speaker, it has a very big solid walnut cap. So this whole angled section here is solid walnut, and you can sand basically until you get through all the imperfections. So one of the sections that I'm going to be focusing on is going to be this little chip here. I don't think I'm going to come down all the way to get this chip to completely disappear, but I'll probably kind of just work it down so that it becomes much less apparent that there's a chip here in the front. So I'll get started on that. I'm going to unload both of these cabinets, and then I'll do another shot once I've got them masked up. And remember, I've already got the crossovers pulled out of here, so none of these drivers are connected. But these two are going to be inside of this middle enclosure, and the speaker wires are inside a putty, so I'll do these last. I think I'm just going to put my hand through the back and try to shove this woofer magnet from the back to get this out. I had these in storage for a while. Some time's elapsed between rebuilding the crossovers and getting to this step, so I needed to get these into storage and had all the drivers loaded back in just for convenience. This is one of the things that's going to be getting replaced, this gasket. Let me grab a screwdriver. See, the wire's kind of tight on there. If I rotate this a little bit, you can see this wire just goes straight down the bottom of the cabinet here. So that's the black wire. I've got it disconnected here. Normally there's a putty in there, so that's probably something that I'll put back in. And this blue one should just link to the other speaker. So what I will have to do is disconnect here. And then this will pull out with the other one. So these two are wired in series. So I think it's the black wire coming in, or sorry, going out, and then it's fed by the yellow wire from the crossover, if I remember correctly. All right, so I've got that one out. This is marked with a positive here. Negative gets the black wire. It should be the opposite here. Blue will connect to black, and yellow should connect to positive. Let's pull this one. And this is the first set I've seen that has this, it's almost like a clay. Usually this is a gasket that's made out of like a fiber. This one seems like kind of a mix. Yeah, so we've got the blue wire that's just coming through. And then our yellow that goes down to the crossover. Again, this gasket's gonna all get replaced. Let's see if this one, yeah, it should come right out. This is the putty that I was talking about, so that's just fallen out there. I'll replace that with something else when we redo these. I was wrong about the color. This one is white. So I've got white going into positive. The blue exits the negative. And then it goes into the other mid-range drivers positive. And then the negative finally enters on black on its way back to the crossover. So I'm just going to use some scrap cardboard. This piece happens to be about the right size here. Oh, grab the knife with no blade in it. I'm just going to mark this. Cut this with a square and I'll be right back. All right, so this is just to keep sawdust and stuff from getting inside of the cabinet. I'm just going to use a yellow painter's tape. Any painter's tape is fine for this. And what I'm going to try to do is secure this and wrap it around the edge of this black section here. I'm going to end up repainting this black trim so that it all pops. So I'm not too concerned about covering it up. So I think if I just start the tape down like that, yeah, that should work out fine. All right, that is in place. I'm gonna cover up the back as well. This is a pretty small opening, so. You know what, I'll just cut out a quick piece of cardboard for that as well. All right, this cabinet's ready. I'm going to prep the second one and then we will start sanding. Okay, I've got both cabinets prepped. And before I get going, this is just a quick before shot of this side. This is going to turn out beautiful when this is done. The original finish kind of masks some of the beauty of the grain in these. And they actually look pretty nice, but you know, the top on this one is not so good. And I have two of them. Even if this speaker looks really good, I'm going to need the finishes to match. So there's going to be a lot of sanding on here that's actually taking finish off of some really nice looking sides. What I'm going to do is start with the bottom. So this top is pretty bad, but I want to get a gauge of how thick this veneer is. When I'm using an orbital sander, I don't want to go crazy and accidentally cut through the veneer layer. So I'm going to start on the bottoms of these that are really scratched up, and we will see how deep we can go with the sander. Okay, that was actually really forgiving. This bottom was pretty messed up with some deep scratches, and you can kind of see some of the stuff down here. What I did is I just used the edge of the sandpaper to get in there and get the finish out. This is still going to be in there when we put the finish on this, but again, this is the bottom. But that came out really nice. This was 100 grit, so I'll be going back over this with some finer grit, but I think I'm okay to go around the rest of the cabinet and do the same thing. Okay, let's take a look at this thing and see how I did. And hopefully some of the mistakes that I made on this, you guys can avoid when you refinish yours. And I will try to make the second one turn out a lot better. So first of all, you can see the color difference. We're down to raw walnut here, so this is fairly light, and the original finish is fairly dark. So the top, remember, it had all of those watermarks and stuff. So basically all of that is gone. I used the orbital sander with 100 grit to start. And that worked really well for taking down the finish on the big surfaces, but that's a powerful tool, and we're not careful on the edge. Just a little bit too much pressure can cut through the veneer. So that's what happened here. I'm pretty sure this was not pre-existing. I think that this was me sanding a little bit too aggressively. So on the next one, I'm going to do the edges with a sanding block, and then just use the power tool for the middle of the panels just to speed up the process. When I came around to the front edge, I started with the orbital sander on here, and it just wasn't the right method. I ended up going to a sanding block instead. It's a little bit slower, but it allowed me to maintain a nice sharp edge, and I think that turned out really good actually. So that was definitely the better process there, was sanding block by hand. Some other stuff. While I was moving this thing around, I created this chip here, so I'm gonna have to fill that. And then one of the weird things down here, this looks like a factory fill. This was actually underneath the finish. So my guess is when this cabinet was made, there was a little chip here, and before it was finished, it just got a little bit of a glue or some sort of wood filler there. Otherwise, I'm pretty happy with it. All those original deep blemishes are gone. Sorry, it's having trouble focusing here. And it's looking pretty good. So on the next one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a sanding block on all of the edges and kind of get the edges finished first, and then I'll come in with the power tool and finish up the big panels so that hopefully I can avoid going through the veneer like this. But as part of the repair on this corner, I'm going to extend my epoxy over this edge, and hopefully I can make that flush with the top and give it a nice dark pigment, and it should disappear. So overall, I think this is going to be improved from how they were, and I'll come back once I have the second one sanded, and hopefully I've got better results on that one. Okay, I finished sanding the second of the two cabinets. On this one, I used a sanding block and did the edges first so that I kind of knew where I could cut through the finish. And then I took the orbital sander slowly up to that point to make sure I didn't curve it around the edge or something and come through the veneer early. So I'm going to work on the patches. This is the bottom of the second cabinet, and this is the worst surface out of any of them. This speaker must have gotten moved a bunch during its lifetime, and this finish and stuff just got scratched out of the bottom. It has deep gouges and things. But this is the worst corner on this thing, so I'm going to do an example of a epoxy fill on this corner. This is a technique that I learned from a gentleman on the classic speaker pages that goes by the name Jay Kent as part of his work on the KLH Model 8. So basically what I'm doing here is just putting on a piece of blue painter's tape to act as a dam for the epoxy that I'm going to put in here. So the main thing here is this just is going to give me a flat surface on at least two of the edges. So what I do is I overfill this a little bit, and then I come back and I carve it down with a razor blade. So when I'm doing an epoxy fill like this, epoxy doesn't take finish like like the actual walnut veneer here. So I need to kind of pre-color it so that I'm at a decent starting point and it's not drying basically the same color as this. So I'm going to mix up some epoxy with a little bit of dye. We're going to put it in there, let it set, and then we'll carve it flat to match the contour of the veneer. The product that I'm going to be using is called JB Wood Weld. It's just a two-part epoxy that that is colored tan basically, but it really binds well, and when you carve it down flat, it really matches the hardness and gives you a nice flat edge. Sometimes if you use a wood filler, it'll become porous, won't be as strong. This stuff is ultra strong, and it's very good for corner repairs especially. I might use wood filler for little dings and stuff on a flat surface, but for corners I prefer to use epoxy. So this is a two-part system, a hardener and a resin. So we just put equal parts of each. And I try not to mix a big batch of this because it can set up pretty quickly. So I usually mix like a little bit for each section at a time. So kind of got roughly equal amounts. Looks like I need a little bit more of the resin in here. So we've got about roughly equal amounts, and this is going to start reacting as soon as I mix it. So I'm going to put in my dye next. This is Mixol number 22. This is like a tobacco colored dye, and I just put this into to add the pigment to the epoxy so that when it sets brown instead of tan. And then I will do some initial coloring when we're done. So I'm just going to put, it doesn't take much. I'm putting 4 drops in here. What I found is that it will cure and look a really nice brown. It'll be kind of shiny, but when I carve it down and get into the inside of it, it's going to be more of a light gray. So for that reason, I go pretty dark to start. And then I'm just mixing this up with a toothpick. You can see how nice and brown that is. That's way darker than this is going to be, and even darker than what the finish is going to be. But again, when I carve it, it's going to lighten up. And my goal is to get it to as close to what it's going to look like finished as possible, but maybe a little bit lighter so that I have the option to color it with some paint pens and stuff like that if I need to darken it up. If you go too dark, it's kind of hard to make it lighter. So now I'm just going to kind of feed this in to the corner here. And toothpick's good for mixing. It's not as good for applying. You can use like a putty knife or a metal strip or something like that to get it all in there and flattened out. And the main thing is I just want to be at level or higher. And on this one, I'm just going to bend down the tape here and apply a little of this straight to this area before I put the dam back, just because it's really deep. Oops. Come back and grab that with a Q-tip in a second. All right, so that's most of the base edge there, and I'm going to put this back and just push whatever we got left here up against the tape. It's important to overfill a little bit because you can get some bubbles and stuff in this. And sometimes if I don't go deep enough, I will go back and do a second layer, and you might have to do that on a really deep gouge. I think I need a little bit more in this corner. There we go. So I've way overfilled the corner, and you'll see what that looks like when I pull the mask off after this cures. All right, I'm gonna go grab a Q-tip and clean up these overages because I don't want unnecessary work there. All right, this is just a Q-tip with a little bit of water on it. Oops. And I will need to sand through this in the end because that's going to create a little bit of a dark spot. So try not to do that if you can help it, but we'll catch that on the when we flatten this out. So I'm going to let this cure. The instructions, I think, say like 5 or 6 hours. Let's see. Mixture will set in 6 minutes, and then I think it takes, before you want to cut on it, is at least a couple hours. I usually wait 5 or 6 hours. Most of the time I do it at nighttime, and I just set it overnight and then work with it in the morning. But it really does set up fairly quickly, but I've noticed that if I start working on it too quick, it kind of gives and takes a little bit, where I prefer it to be almost rock hard before I start working on it. So I'm gonna go ahead and fill all the rest of the corners like this, and then I'll come back when I'm removing the tape and starting to carve these to shape. All right, about 5 hours have passed, 5-6 hours, and I'm going to start carving up this epoxy. So let me remove the tape on this corner. And you can see how now I've got kind of a flat edge here. It spans out a little bit like this because I can't make a super tight corner on the tape, but I'm going to shave this all down. So my goal here is just to get all of this excess flat so that when I come in and sand, I can get it down to the exact level of the veneer. So I'm just going to use a brand new razor blade. You could use a chisel or something like that as well. The easier ones are going along with the grain. I can just get the blade in here and just start taking this down in layers. You can see here there's a couple little holes here, voids, just inside of the epoxy that just happened as it cured. I can go in there and fill that if I want. I was just to make a decision based on how it looks after sanding, but I might do like a little second coat of epoxy here, a second layer. So I'm getting pretty close to flush here, and you can see the difference. The original curing is this almost glossy brown, but once it's shaved down, it's this nice lighter brown color that actually matches very closely to the original. It's not going to take the finish the same way, so I still will probably need to compensate with some markers or some paint, but it's a really good start. So I just need to go on all of my edges and square this up as best I can, and then when we come back with, we'll do a sanding block, and we'll get this really nice and square. And then sometimes I will do just a scrape just to work it down. And as long as you're going with the grain, it's not going to do any significant damage to the original walnut. So I'm using that just to get through this shiny layer here so that all of the epoxy is the same starting color. And I do have you can see the darker brown here, that's actually a dip, so I'll be filling that in with that second layer. So this is kind of a good starting point for this corner. And when we come back with the sanding block, it'll really square it off. I'm also going to come into here a little bit just to get that section covered. So it does, usually with this method, it takes me a couple coats, I guess you would call it, or layers in order to get everything correct. But the main thing is getting this squared up again, and I'll come back and do some more shots with what this looks like when it's finished. I just finished all of the epoxy fill on the cabinets. So I've gone through all four sides and touched up all the corners, filled in some gaps here from some expansion, things like that. So this is after the epoxy has been built up a couple of times and then prepped with a razor blade, and then I came through with 220 grit sandpaper with the grain in each direction to bring this to a nice square corner. So I've done that on all the corners. Some other things on this cabinet, remember I had an issue sanding on the top and I came through the veneer. What I found is that the veneer on this one was actually coming up like this. So what happened is I came across here with the orbital sander, I was on this surface, and since this was so much higher, that's what took that down so fast. So after I did the epoxy fill on this and sanded again, I got everything nice and smooth and flush, but some of the MDF is still exposed after sanding. So in other words, I've got this all flat, but since the veneer is curled up a little bit from moisture expansion or something, if I want it to feel flat, I can't use a fill there. So I'm gonna have to just use some brown paint to cover that up before I do the final finish. Let me show you some other stuff on this cabinet. Luckily, the worst damage is on the bottom of one of the cabinets. This was that corner that I was demonstrating on, so you can see how nice that came out compared to where we started. And then I have another section here where it's through the veneer, and it's the same thing where this must have had some sort of water expansion and came up like that. So on this one, again, I'm going to have to prep with paint after the final sanding and before the final finish. And luckily that's on the bottom. So let's get started on the final prep. I'm going to be doing a Danish oil finish, and for that I like to go down to 1000 grit. So the reason that we finish wood and don't leave it raw is because it protects it and it seals it. And you can already see, like, I've got pretty oily hands and some of my fingerprints and stuff are getting into the finish here. So what I'm going to do is go over it again with 220 grit everywhere, and then do 1000 grit, follow up with some alcohol, get it really clean before we do the Danish oil finish. And of course, I'm going to do the paint here first and see if that kind of darkens up under the first finish layer. We'll see how that turns out. Okay, this again is going to be 220 grit on the sanding block. Switching to 1000 grit. Eventually I'm going to be prepping all the other sides, but just wanted to show this step. I'm going to be putting some alcohol on here just to get all the last bits of dust picked up. You want the surface to be extremely clean when we apply the first coat of oil. So I'm just going to fill this into a spray bottle. And when we spray this down, you're going to see or get an idea of how the finish is going to end up looking once we do the oil. Also, if we go on, let's see, I don't have a good point here close to the camera, but it looks like once we get that epoxy wet, that the color is going to match pretty well. So hopefully I don't need to go back and do too many more touch-ups. So you see, after we wipe this with the alcohol, all that dust is gone, and you can start to see how beautiful this grain is going to end up being once finished. Look at that one. So this is something that the original finish would have covered up, this nice sapwood line. And this also reveals stuff like this here. That's the MDF underneath, that little spot there and back here. So I'm going to be going around with that brown paint and touching up all these spots so that that's not underneath the finish. So for these sections here, I'm just going to use some brown paint to prep them. This is a bottom side, so I'm not too concerned about it. The colors that I have for brown are kind of in between what I need, so I'm going to do a mix of these two and hopefully end up at a nice spot. Now this is kind of experimental on my part. It may be better to do the paint after the finish. I don't know how the finish is going to react with this paint, but we're going to give it a shot and see how it turns out. And I can always resort back to sanding if needed. All right, so definitely there. So I've got this side here and just a little spot there that I need to touch up. We're going to start finishing with this bottom side because I want to see how everything works with this painted edge. So I'm going to just wipe down this whole cabinet with alcohol one last time before we start the finish. And for this, I'm going to be using Watco Dark Walnut Danish Oil. I've used this for years. This is actually almost empty. I've used this on so many different cabinets, but Watco Danish Oil is usually available at Home Depot and Lowe's. Pretty easy to find. It looks like I probably went a little bit too dark on this paint, just on this alcohol test, because when I spray the alcohol on it, or water, that's about how dark it's going to get when we put the oil on. So we'll see how this ends up, but we'll start on that side, and then I'll demonstrate one of the big surfaces as well. So for doing the wipe-on finish, I use just cut up t-shirt material. You can buy shop rags and stuff. Usually just a lint-free cloth is fine. I'm just going to put a glove on my right hand here. And then with the cover on the oil, I'm just going to make sure it's mixed. And again, this was sanded down to 1000 grit. So I was just refinishing a Macintosh cabinet actually, so I've got a rag that's saturated. And a quick note on rags, when you're done with these, both the one that you apply with and wipe with, you want to lay these out flat somewhere to get mostly dry before you dispose of them. Any sort of chemical finish like this has a potential to spontaneously combust and cause a fire. So just make sure that you properly dispose of your rags. So right now I'm just applying the finish directly to the walnut. And on this first one, we want to apply this pretty thick, and depending on the environment that the wood's been in or how long it's been since you sanded it, it might really want to soak up this finish. So on the very first coat, you actually have to go back a couple times. And we can start to see here some of the epoxy that I mixed is ending up really close on this corner. Because this is almost like a sapwood section here and this got lighter, it's a little bit too light on this edge, but on the more typical walnut colored sections, this is coming out pretty nice. So far so good on the epoxy fills, I think. And this is the bottom of the cabinet, but we are going to have an issue with darkness here on the painted sections. So I'm starting to think maybe the better thing was to do the final paint afterwards. And I'll see that in the other cabinet. I might strip or sand right back through that paint and just do the oil. But this is on the bottom on this one. I'm not too concerned about it. And once this whole thing is covered, we're going to let it sit for about 20 to 30 minutes and then wipe off as much as possible with clean rags. And we'll see, this is why I like refinishing these KLH cabinets. Look at this walnut. It's just beautiful. You can see I'm applying, I usually go with the grain on this. This is going to need to get another coat on before I let it sit, because it's sucking it up already. So next up, I'm just going to tip this down in its back, and then I'll be able to do the rest of the sides. So this is actually the top of this speaker. You can see I had a little drip there. I like to put down a piece of cardboard when doing this so that I don't get my floor full of oil. So there's still a couple of scratches there, but it doesn't look bad. All right, I'm going to finish this one out and I'll come back. We'll look at the top of the second one and see if I can do something else with that paint. Okay, this is the top of the second speaker. This is the one that had the veneer breakthrough. And actually I'm noticing if we look close at the wood, I must have had something stuck in the orbital sanding wheel, and you can see these little circular patterns that are inside of the grain there. So I'm going to actually sand this again with a coarse sandpaper, and then I've already started on this. The paint that I applied, I'm just taming it down with some alcohol and getting it to be mostly gone. Like you can see in this area here, it's already starting to lighten up a little bit where it's darker over here. So I'll probably sand through some of this to get some of these patterns out of there. Hopefully I didn't go too deep already, we'll see. So I'm gonna try again to get this surface prepped a little bit better and then tame this down so it's not so dark like we saw on the bottom of the other speaker. Okay, if we take a closer look here, you can see that those circular patterns are gone now. And then on this edge here, I've just removed most of the paint that was on there. And you saw when I did the alcohol that at least in the sections that are mostly epoxy here, it's going to match pretty well. And then I think what I'll do is I'll just come up and try to match the paint as close as possible and come back and do touch-ups after I do the finish, because this part's not going to get dark. That's just going to stay light. That's the exposed fiberboard beneath. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and oil this one up, and we'll see how it turns out. You can see this surface is really dry. The oil is sucking right into it, and I almost have to get another coat on it before, or it's almost starting to dry in before I even finish the panel. So I'm gonna go with another pass here. All right, let's take a closer look at this corner. And the color match is actually not bad on the corner itself. This I'm going to touch up with paint. And I've got a little couple spots and voids in here where the epoxy didn't come completely flush. But I've got these little kind of divots and marks and stuff in the cabinet itself, and it all kind of goes in. So I'm leaving that alone. I could go crazy and put this back in, but it seems like every time on this one, because of that raised edge, every time I went in there with the blade, I'd end up chipping out more of the finish. So I think I'm content here. I'm looking at here is like this little black dot. It looks very similar to these voids in the epoxy. So I think that's good to go, and then we'll just touch up the light spots with paint in the end. So actually this surface turned out pretty well. We'll flip this one down and do that side again. Let's see which one's going to be most satisfying to look at. This is a funny one. This one, let's flip this down so we can see it. Got a big old thumbprint there with oil, but yeah, this is an interesting surface here. Let's see how this turns out with the oil. Oh, this will be interesting. This side is very light, and I bet this cap is kind of dark. So we're gonna get, this is something you don't get with the original finish because it kind of darkens everything. Oops, lost a little bit of oil there. But yeah, the original finish is a little bit darker, kind of darkens everything up. And this lighter colored walnut will kind of blend more in with this dark cap that's on this side. But I actually kind of like the contrast. I'll swing over to this other cabinet in a second. It has a really light side. And I like looking at various wood grains. I like seeing stuff like that where you get a little bit more contrast. Other people might want it to look more consistent, but I tend to like looking at the unique sides. This side again, it's like this whole speaker cabinet may have been from a slightly different batch of walnut or something. This is really sucking in the finish. And the way that Danish Oil works is it cures inside of the wood. So this top layer is soaking into the wood itself, and then it'll cure and become hard. And then the subsequent coats, we start building on top of the oil itself. And that's how you develop that sheen. So I always do at least 3 coats, sometimes 4, depending on how shiny I want it to get. That's good for now. Let me swing you over so we can take a look at the contrast on this other cabinet. See if I can get this in the sun. Lower this down a little bit here. So on this cabinet here, this whole side is very light. And then when it comes up against that ultra dark walnut cap, I really like how that looks. Even though it's not consistent with the other sides, it's got a beautiful, tight grain pattern. And then against that dark walnut cap, I just really like it. So one of the interesting things that you get on these when you refinish them is you get a little bit more of the character out of the wood that usually gets hidden with the original finish. Okay, I'm going to flip this one down and do the rest of the sides, and then we'll move on to the next step, which is wiping the excess off after about 20-30 minutes of sitting. This is the first cabinet. It's been sitting for about 20 minutes. We're now going to go back with a clean cloth and just remove any excess oil that's sitting on the surface, and then it's going to sit and cure for about at least 24 hours. So what I'm doing here is just wiping down with a fair amount of pressure, and we should see a little bit of excess oil transferring to the cloth as we go over all of the surfaces. And you don't want to wait too long before doing this. If you forgot about it and waited for an hour or so, it'll come back and it might be kind of tacky. And if that happens, sometimes you can't remove it without creating issues. So make sure you set a timer when doing this step and don't let it sit too long. I tipped up this side of the cabinet, and this is a really good angle of this where we can see it in the sun, where this is where it's soaked in a little bit more, and this is where there's excess sitting on there that needs to get wiped. So we'll see as I wipe it that it all gets to that kind of same level. And here it's picking up a lot more. This whole side, I either oiled more than the others or it didn't soak up the oil as much as the other sides. So a lot of it's transferring to the cloth, which is fine. The main thing is we just want this to be as dry as possible to enter this next stage. And with this in the sun, you can see how this sheen kind of works. This is one of the reasons I love Danish Oil. It's a wipe-on, which is just, easy application versus doing a brush or a spray or something like that. And you can build up the finish until you get to the sheen you want. And if damage ever gets caused to it, you can usually just apply another coat of oil and it will help reduce any major scratches, or you can even get rid of some watermarks that way of just lightly buffing and doing a fresh coat of oil on it. So it's a finish that's easy to maintain and it looks good. So basically the only downside to Danish Oil is it takes a lot of patience. This is going to be a 3 to 4 day process in between coats. So it's not something for somebody in a rush, but if it's a set of speakers that you're going to be keeping for a while, it's definitely worth the time. Got about 24 hours here since the first coat was applied. And the next step here is going to be using quadrupolate steel wool to buff all of the surfaces before the next coat goes on. That's just to smooth things out. And as we buff it, the sheen will start to come out. So I'm going to do that here now and buff all the surfaces and then throw on the second coat. After they're buffed, we can see the sheen is starting to develop. You see the light is reflecting off of the wooden surfaces. So this is kind of just the base coat. We've got the color applied and started protecting the wood. And the remaining coats that we put on here are just going to build on top of the finish itself, and it's just going to get more and more consistent and shiny as we go. So now I'm just going to apply another coat of oil, wait that 20-30 minutes or so, and then give it a good wipe. Again, you don't want to wait too long or it will get too tacky and then it won't wipe well. So in my haste to get these speakers back up onto the table to do the next coat of oil, I had a little accident. And this is kind of how this stuff happens in the wild. So I've lost my entire back corner of the top of one of the speakers. Luckily, I do have this little piece here. So I'm going to be getting that piece glued back in, and then I'll have to do a fill on this. So I can't continue on this speaker until I get this corner repaired again. I was able to glue this top corner piece back in place. There's a tiny little bit of a rise here, but overall it's sitting in there pretty flush, and I think once I do another coat on here, that should work out. So now I'm just going to fill this here, and I'm gonna try out a different method. I'm going to be using a different epoxy from the JB Weld company called JB Kwik. So it looks like this. I'm gonna give this a shot. It should set up much faster, and it may be a better product because since I already have finish on this side, I'm hoping that I can make it flush and manipulate it a little bit easier than the more liquidy JB Wood Weld. So I still really like the JB Wood Weld for corner fills, and once this is all done, I'll go around and show some of the repairs and we'll see the results. But I'm gonna give this product a try, this Kwik, and we'll see how this works. So it looks like this comes in a tube, and we need to mix these two parts together. And I'm also going to, the instructions say that it's okay to use a pigment. So I'm just going to cut off a small section here. And let's add a few drops of this Mixol 22. And then to activate it, kind of like the two-part JB Wood Weld, I'm going to knead this together, mixing those two sections, and this should become like a putty. Yeah, it's almost like a clay. It looks like the color is having a hard time getting in there. I'll try one more drop of this. And the instructions do say if you're going to use a pigment, test it first. But we're just going to go for it. You guys can learn from me. Well, that's kind of cool. I'm almost getting like a pattern inside of it with that last drop that I added. All right, that's getting pretty dark. Let's take the camera up and see if we can apply this. All right, so I'm just going to take some of this out and see if I can get it into this area. Well, that didn't take much at all. Instructions also suggest using a putty knife. So I'm going to give that a shot. I don't have a putty knife, but this little thing I used to cut it has worked pretty well in the past and other things. I'm just going to try to flatten this out. Well, this was starting out nice. Now it's getting a little messy. think that's the ticket there. I've got this side nice and flat, and then I can come in here with the blade. Basically, I've just pushed some of this out this way and into the top, and then I'm just going to use a moist paper towel and give a quick wipe on the top there. Okay, I'm gonna let that sit for a few hours and we'll come back and see how it turned out. The epoxy's been curing for the better part of a day, so we're at probably about 6 or 7 hours. And it's really solid. Like, this stuff's set up really nice even with the pigment. So I might use this consistently for doing stuff that is minor repairs where I'm just gonna do restore finish, because it was so much easier to create a flat edge with it than with the other two-part epoxy. So with this, this was my kind of overflow edge here, so I'm just using the razor blade to flatten that out. On here, this already has finish on it, so I don't want to go too crazy here. And I don't know if this is going to change the color. See, that lightened that up a little bit, which I don't necessarily want, so. And well, that's onto the walnut. That should be fine. So actually that's feathering in pretty nicely there, besides that little white mark. That's probably like a bubble in the epoxy. But overall, this is gonna end up being a good corner repair. I think once the finish goes onto this, we should be in good shape. So now that my unfortunate accident here has been repaired, I'm doing another buff of all the surfaces with quadruple aught steel wool before I apply the third coat of oil. This is probably the best surface out of all of them as far as grain pattern, and the finish is just really bringing this side to life. So this is only after 2 coats. The third coat it'll get even shinier. Let's see how this repaired corner takes the finish, because this is my first time using this epoxy. I don't know how dark it's going to get once we put oil on it. And then also there's this light section of walnut that I hit a little bit with the razor blade, so we'll see if that starts to darken up. You can definitely see the difference in texture. I think once we go through there, and what might end up happening is, since I've got, you know, 1 layer down on this corner, I might end up doing a 4th coat of oil on just this side if all the other sides look good at 3, but I still have some inconsistency in this corner. I might do a 4th coat just on this whole surface. We'll take a look at that after this has all been wiped. This is 3rd coat applied. About 20 minutes has passed. I'm going to go ahead and wipe the excess on this cabinet. What I like to do is start with a rag that I've used on a previous step to get the bulk off, and then once I do that, I come in with a fresh rag and try to get as much as possible off before I let these set up. And I'm going to be away for the weekend, so before I buff this, these are going to get another about 3 days of drying before I see them again. And again, this whole process is not for somebody in a hurry. If you're a master of delayed gratification, this can be a pretty satisfying project, but if you're in a hurry, you won't get good results with this finish if you speed up the time, you know, shorten your time between coats. It's really an exercise in patience, following the steps, and being methodical about each application and sanding in between, and then you end up with an amazing finish. So again, it's worth the effort, but it does take a long time, you know, multiple days to get a final product. So this has all been wiped down with that semi-used cloth. Now I'm going to go with this clean cloth, and you'll see just how much is still left on there. So there's still, there's still excess that can come off, and if you leave that excess on, it's just going to be kind of a sticky layer on there that's going to be harder for you to buff through with the steel wool. So I usually take this step just to get it as dry as possible before I set it up for the long-term cure. This is what that corner looks like after the excess finish has been rubbed off from the third coat. You can see that epoxy fill ended up taking the color quite well. And I may switch over to this and use this as my default method moving forward. It's a little bit easier to work with to form that putty into the crack rather than having the more liquid 2-part epoxy and having to do a lot more carving on it. So I think I'll try this on the next time I do a cabinet repair on all the edges and see how that product works. I might switch over to that. But this also goes to show just how easy Danish Oil is to work with. I was halfway through the finishing process when I had this error. I was able to fill and come back in, and the color blended pretty darn well. So this is something where if a catastrophic accident like that happens 3-4 years down the road, you can just do a fill and lightly buff or sand the surface and put another coat of oil down, and you can recover that corner without having to refinish the entire piece. So another reason I really like working with Danish Oil. The 5s have been sitting with the third coat for about 3 days. And that's just because I was gone for the weekend. You really only need 24 hours or so. But I'm going to go ahead and do the final buff on these, and then I'll put them up on some Lazy Susans, and we'll see how the finish turned out. All right, the Danish Oil finish is complete on the KLH 5s. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Got a good sheen. My corners came out good. This is that last one we were working on. On this one, I have a little bit of touch-up to do on the cap. There's a section here where there was like a knot and a factory fill, so I'm just going to darken that up with a bit of brown paint. And then same thing goes on this one. I just have to do a little bit of final touch-up on this back edge. But overall, these cabinets came out pretty nice. The next step that I'm going to show here is by no means necessary or even recommended for that matter. This is just something that I saw and I was like, wow, this really makes these speakers pop. So I was on a KLH Facebook group, and somebody had posted a picture of a restoration they had done, and their entire baffle was painted black, and it just really made the drivers pop. It made the speakers actually look presentable with the grills off, which is rare for this model. So we can see this is in stock form. It's just exposed brown like fiber or pressed board that makes up the cabinet, and the number 5 written there. So they're not very sightly, and they have these green Velcro stickers. So when the grill's off, they really don't look that appealing. So what I'm going to do is try to duplicate what that gentleman did and paint the baffles black and see how it turns out. So to start with that, I've already got this one prepped over here. So I'll just go through the process on this one. I'm just going to pull my mask from earlier. All right, I'm going to put on some gloves, start with this insulation. You can see that insulation dust getting into the air here. This stuff really is quite nasty. I'm going to save this cheesecloth. I'm going to reuse that behind the woofers. Now, you can reuse this by all means. It's just, for me, it's been really uncomfortable working with it, so I'm gonna replace it. All right, next up, I'm gonna pull the old gasket material. All right, now I'm going to remove these old Velcro pieces, and I'm going to save them because I might be able to reuse these, but I just didn't want to paint over them. I think it'll turn out better if I put some new Velcro on. So right now I'm just getting a flathead screwdriver underneath the staple and slowly lifting that out. Okay, now I need to mask all the nice walnut. So on this one I used a big plastic bag. I cut out a rectangle using my cardboard mask as a template and then kind of just taped in around. But then to get it all held together, I put some shrink wrap on. I thought maybe it'll just be faster to shrink wrap this thing. All right, that should do. I'm just going to flip this on its top just to make sure that I get this back edge fully masked. All right, let's go paint. I'm going to be trying Krylon Matte Black. Took a few coats, but it's looking good. Let's unmask these things and see how it turned out. Wow, what a difference from stock. That looks crazy good. This is going to conclude part 2 of the KLH Model 5 restoration. At this point, the vast majority of the cosmetic work is complete. Part 3 will focus on loading the drivers back into the cabinet, making up some gaskets, doing the polyfill, and all of that. So again, thanks for stopping by the channel, and we will see you on the next one.